All right, let's dive into a story that you think you know, but you probably don't. It all starts with a piece of folklore that's so common we barely even notice it anymore. But it might just be masking one of the biggest and frankly saddest social phenomena in modern history.
Okay, picture this. That's not from a dream. That's a description of the oldest surviving narrative film we have, made right around the year 1900 by the pioneering director Alice Guy Blanche. The very first story cinema ever told was about a fairy harvesting babies from a garden.
And that's the real question here, isn't it? Out of all the myths, all the legends, all the dramas in the entire world, why did the brand new art of cinema kick off with this specific, kind of strange little tale? Well, the answer is way more complicated than you'd think.
Now, on the surface, the explanation seems pretty simple. It's just a charming old bit of folklore. You know, a story you tell kids to sidestep some awkward conversations.
For centuries, this was pretty much the standard explanation across Europe, especially in France. It was a simple, whimsical answer to a very complicated question. Boys come from the cabbage patch, girls come from the rose bushes. All neat and tidy.
And this idea was absolutely everywhere. I mean, French parents still call their kids my little cabbage. In Scotland and Ireland, different versions of the myth were used to explain where a new baby brother or sister came from. So it seems like a pretty straightforward cultural tradition. But if we dig just a little bit deeper, the story isn't nearly this simple.
Let's go to a place where things start to get a lot less innocent. A place where that line between folklore and a really grim reality, it starts to get very blurry. Right, because if this was just a harmless fairy tale, the story should end there. But it doesn't. When we actually look at the historical timeline, that charming explanation starts to completely fall apart, and it reveals something much, much darker underneath.
Okay, this is where the timeline gets really fascinating. Just 3 months before she directed cinema's first story, Alice Guy visited a storefront exhibit. Inside, premature babies were being kept alive in glass incubators, which were literally modeled on equipment used for poultry, and people paid admission to come in and just watch them. The German name for this exhibit was Kinderbruttenstalt, which translates to the child hatchery. Seeing babies displayed like that right before making a film about babies being harvested from a garden, that connection it's really hard to ignore.
And you have to remember, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the absolute peak of a massive, systemic crisis, the abandonment and displacement of hundreds of thousands of children.
Just in the United States, 250,000 kids were transported on what were called orphan trains between 1854 and 1929. They were shipped out west and literally offered up for selection on train platforms, a lot of the time just for farm labor.
And in Europe, the situation was even more staggering. In major cities during the 1800s, as many as 1 out of every 3 babies was abandoned to a foundling institution. 1 in 3. And the reality for those children? Inside these institutions, the average death rate was a jaw-dropping 80%. It was practically a death sentence.
This was the system that made it all possible. The foundling wheel. A mother could place her baby inside this rotating cylinder, ring a bell, and just walk away, forever anonymous. A child could appear out of nowhere with no parents, no name, no history.
So, with that historical context rattling around in your head, let's look at the cultural stuff that was being produced at the exact same time. Specifically, this massive international postcard craze.
Now, most art historians tend to just dismiss these Cabbage baby postcards as simple, sentimental birth announcements. But artists like Salvador Dali, they saw something way deeper. They actually collected them because they recognized this strange, unsettling power that went way beyond just being whimsical. And you can totally see why. The imagery is often so transactional. It shows babies being harvested, couples browsing for babies like they're picking out produce, and even references to children being sold or won in lotteries. This isn't just about birth, it's about acquisition. It's about distribution.
So here's the crucial point. The language of these postcards, the imagery, it mirrors the mechanics of the orphan trains and the foundling wheels with a really disturbing accuracy. A child appears without parents, is selected, and then is taken to a new home.
Now you might think, okay, that's all a fascinating historical curiosity. But the story doesn't end in the 1920s. Oh no. It came roaring back in a form that millions of us remember.
Just think about the Cabbage Patch Kids phenomenon of the 1980s.
The story is identical. You have parentless babies that are born in a garden. They're distributed from a fake medical institution called a hospital, and you don't buy them, you adopt them, and you even get official papers.
And this slide just lays it out so perfectly. The parallels are they're undeniable. The origin without parents, the selection by a stranger, the distribution through an institution, a new name, and then a new home. It is the entire system of historical foundling networks, just repackaged and sold as a tour.
So, let's pull all these threads together and ask the big question. What has this story been doing for all these centuries?
Well, think about it. You don't tell a child their new sibling was left in a box in a wall. You don't explain that 250,000 kids were shipped across the country with their identities totally stripped away. You tell a simple, easy-to-digest story. You say they came from the Cabbage Patch. The fairy tale makes the uncomfortable truth just disappear.
And just think about how persistent this one story has been. It was there at the very birth of cinema. It exploded into a postcard craze at the exact same time that child displacement was at its absolute peak. And then it came back as the biggest toy fad of the modern era, all of them using the exact same imagery.
So what do you think? Is all of this just a massive 800-year-long coincidence? Or is the story of babies from the Cabbage Patch something else entirely? A cultural narrative we created to explain where all the children were coming from, because the real answer was just too painful to face. Maybe the story isn't about where babies come from at all. Maybe, just maybe, it's a story we tell ourselves about where children go.